Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing a past paper question from May-June 2023, paper 21. And the question says, with the help of an ADS diagram, explain cost-push inflation and demand pull inflation in an economy and consider in what circumstances one may be more damaging than the other. Interesting question. So let's look at the structure that we need to follow for this question. So first of all, we'll go on by defining what inflation is. We'll also tell that inflation is an important macroeconomic objective. We talk about price stability a bit, probably in a line or so, not more than a line. It's an 8-mark question. We'll mention that there are two primary causes of inflation. Inflation coming from the spending side, which is demand pull, and then inflation that occurs due to a rise in input prices, that is cost push inflation. We'll mention that, and then the explanation, the diagrams, and then the process of how that inflation occurs would come in the analysis part. This is just the introduction part that we're talking about. That is your knowledge and understanding, the assessment objective of knowledge and understanding. And then we'll draw the ADS diagrams, and then the analysis for this inflation's, two types of inflation will take place. And then we'll move on to the evaluation part, because now you have evaluation for an 8-mark question as well, and 2 marks are assigned for that. And because the question says, and consider in what circumstances one may be more damaging than the other. So this is what the evaluation is, right? So evaluate which is more damaging, and you have so there are 2 marks for designed for 2 marks kept for this, and then we'll end the answer based on a conclusion, and I'll show you how you'll evaluate and then what could be a probable conclusion. Now if you look at this question, the question is saying, with the help of diagrams, explain cost push and demand pull. So the idea is that you need to explain what demand pull and cost push is with the help of a diagram. So the diagram has to aid the explanation or corroborate the explanation, or augment the explanation, but the core thing is the explanation itself, not the diagram. Understood? Number 2. So ignoring this part evaluation right now, because it's something that we need to see in the end, how you start your answer. What's a good way to start your answer? Now, a good way to start your answer is not just start off with defining what cost push and demand pull is, but instead you start off with what inflation is, and you say that inflation is an increase in the general price level in the economy over a period of time. And then you say that low and stable inflation, which is known as price stability, is a very important or core macroeconomic objective of the government. And economists and policymakers are particularly interested in the inflation rate in an economy, because since inflation rates has both domestic and external consequences that can have damaging consequences for the aggregate economy or for the wider economy if that inflation rate is left unchecked and unmonitored, right? And then you say that economists measure inflation using the consumer price index, bracket CPI. So this should be your opening paragraph, and this should maximum take 3.5 lines. That's it, right? And you see, that's a good introduction that ideally will be your examiner will be impressed. Other than introductions, I would directly start off by defining what cost push and demand pull inflation is. Well, that could work as well, but you see, my job is right now is to tell you the best possible way that you could potentially answer. So introductions, guys, should be nice and to the point and clear, and because in introductions they basically set the precedence for your whole essay, right? Now the next step here would be that you basically mention that inflation occurs in the economy for 2 reasons, basically, and one is associated with the demand side, that is the AD, and the other is your supply side, as in there are factors happening in the economy causing either of the two, that is the either AD or AS, or maybe both, to change or be affected, which in turn causes the price level to go up, right? So you mentioned that your inflation is of 2 types, and these are the causes, that is coming from the demand and from the supply side. Now, guys, the next step would be that you move on to explaining what demand pull inflation is, and then and then here is when your main analysis for the question will start. That is assessment objective 2, where you differentiate between demand pull and cost push inflation via the diagrams as well. Now, so you'll say that, and we'll start off with demand pull inflation, and you'll say that demand pull inflation basically occurs when the price level in the economy goes up due to a rise in aggregate spending in the economy, more than what the economy can produce at its current level of productive capacity. So your AD is going up more than what the economy could end up producing, or the firms could end up producing at the current level of productive capacity what they have, because obviously economy has a fixed productive capacity. Now the thing is that you need to sort of when you're explaining demand for inflation, a lot of students say that demand for inflation occurs because of a rise in aggregate demand when consumer spending goes up, or exports go up, or government spending goes up. Now, this is not wrong, but this is incomplete because you haven't really explained the process why demand for inflation would occur, and a lot of students will not end up writing it, while you should write it, and you are encouraged to write the process in the exam. Not in a lot of detail, but do mentioning and touching upon it. I'll also explain you the process in detail in this video so that you can sort of grasp the concept. But just saying that demand for inflation occurs because of a rise in AD will not do the job. I mean, will not fully do the job, okay? So what we're saying is that demand for inflation is occurring in the economy as the price level is going up from P1 to P2 because of a rise in aggregate demand. But then the thing is that, the aggregate spending in the economy is rising more than what the economy can end up producing at its current level of productive capacity. So simply put, what we're saying is that when the spending in the economy rises, and it rises faster than the economy's ability to produce them, or to produce basically goods and services, what it does is that when AD is going up, it creates excess spending and demand in the economy. And as a result, firms basically respond by hiring more factors of production. And this then puts pressure on the economies and firms' capacity as economy tries to produce more output at unsustainable levels, by asking workers to work overtime more than the normal hours, and the plant and machinery and the factories are being run at more than normal capacity, maybe 24/7, putting pressure on labor and capital, and hence increasing the costs of the firms in an attempt to produce more output. Now, this is not cost push inflation. Just because you're saying that the cost is rising doesn't mean that it's cost push inflation, and I'll tell you why. Because here the cost is going up in an attempt to produce more output because it's putting more pressure on the existing factors of production. So it will increase the cost for the firms in an attempt to produce more output in response of rising spending and demand in the aggregate economy. So in an attempt to produce more output in response of rising spending and demand in the aggregate economy, which then feeds through and sieves through the wider economy in the form of demand for inflation. This is what demand for inflation actually is, and this is what demand for inflation, why demand for inflation actually happens. And then you'll say that this is represented in diagram A, where rising aggregate demand from 81 to 82, as you can see in this demand. In this diagram, increases your price level from P1 to P2. As the economy and firms adjusts, as AD goes up, the economy and the firms adjusts and adapts to rising AD. By trying to produce more output by putting more pressure on the existing factors of production. So what's happening here is, the guys, that yes, demand, your output is going up. You can see that if your real GDP goes up from Y1 to Y2, and yes, your output is going up, and real GDP will go up. But we also see that when AD is rising, when AD rises from 81 to 82, you sort of approach your full employment level of GDP. That is, you approach your full capacity. That is your potential GDP, or your full employment level of output, that is YFE. And as you approach your full employment level of GDP, or you approach your potential GDP, because your potential GDP is the level of maximum output that you can produce. YFE is the maximum output that you can produce at sustainable levels using your factors of production sustainably, right? So as your economy is approaching or gets close to full capacity, which means it's nearing full capacity, it means that more pressure will be put on your existing factors of production, because now they will get scarcer and firms will compete for your existing factors of production, and there would be shortages in your labor markets. And this basically increases the costs for the firms and why the cost is going up for the firm? Because the firms will end up paying them more in order to produce more. So the firms will say, hey, you know what, you need to work 20 hours a day, and we'll end up paying you more because you are working extra, but then you are also producing more, right? And then as the cost goes up, the firms pass on these higher costs to the economy back as higher prices, because obviously it's more profitable for the firms as well to pass on these higher costs back on the economy, because the firms the economy is ready to pay higher prices because of higher spending power, right? and it makes logical sense as well. And in this way, the firms could also end up making more profits. This is what demand push inflation is. But in a cost push inflation, when you say that the cost of production is rising, it's rising exogenously, independently, in the sense that for the same level of output, the cost is rising. Here, the cost is rising because you're producing more output. But over there, the cost is rising because input prices are rising for the same level of output, right? And I'll explain that in a bit. But anyways, so what's happening here is that, another way to explain demand pull inflation is also by saying that as AD increases or outstrips your aggregate supply, shortages would occur across the wide various sectors throughout the economy. Again putting pressure on prices to again go up, right? And you can also make your normal, you can also make your classical diagram for your ADAS, where you say that your aggregate demand goes up. So this diagram where you say that your AD goes up from 81 to 82, and then this causes your price level to sort of increase, would be valid and acceptable as well. But then the mechanism is the same, right? And I mean, so 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 like I said, shortages would occur across various sectors throughout the economy, putting pressure on prices to go up. And the situation, when demand pull inflation usually occurs, it's a situation usually represented by rapid growth or unsustainable growth in the economy. And demand pull inflations are typically associated with economic booms, right? And do remember though that as AD and spending rapidly grows, when your aggregate demand and aggregate spending is rapidly growing in the economy, businesses will take advantage of this as well, of this high demand, by raising prices in an attempt to increase their profits. So this is what demand pull inflation actually is. And then do mention the fact that aggregate demand is comprising of consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net export spending, because aggregate demand is your total spending, right? So, and that total spending in the economy, don't say it's total demand, it's actually total spending. And I have a video on aggregate demand as well, an introduction to aggregate demand, what it is. You can see that on my channel. And so total spending comprises of consumption spending, investment spending, government, and net export spending. So if either of these changes, so if it would result in a positive demand shock. And this, guys, is representing a positive demand shock, right? Even this is representing a positive demand shock, right? So it could be caused due to change, fall in interest rates. If interest rates goes down, cost of borrowing goes down, and that makes it easy for consumers and firms to borrow. Hence, consumption spending and investment spending goes up. So C and I component of AD equation goes up, right? And that causes a rise in aggregate demand. Or maybe the government spending goes up. Maybe the government is as part of its maybe fiscal policy has enacted a budget deficit this year and wants to spend more on the economy, and that sort of they're spending more on maybe income support, or maybe spending more infrastructure, education, healthcare, or maybe public sector wages, and that causes a rise in AD, and that would definitely cause a rise in, and that would again cause inflationary pressures. So maybe your exchange rate has sort of weakened, your value of the currency goes down, maybe your currency depreciates, which obviously makes your exports cheaper and your imports expensive. That will cause a rise in aggregate demand in the economy. But here you need to assume that the PD for imports and exports is more than one elastic, right? So do mention these things briefly in the exam, and that sort of sums up what demand pull inflation is in the economy. But nevertheless, do remember that demand pull inflation is associated with rising real GDP and reduction in cyclical demand deficit unemployment as well, right? And I just remember one more point that you could write, and under demand pull inflation, is that demand pull inflation could also occur when your aggregate demand is increasing because of a rise in consumer and business confidence. Because if your economy is doing well and your economy is booming, then consumers and firms feel secure. Consumers feel secure regarding their employment, and businesses feel secure regarding their risks associated with taking risky investment decisions. So what happens is that the level of investments goes up, and so does the level of consumption spending goes up. As consumers and businesses spend and invest in order to seek higher utilities, and in order to seek higher satisfaction from the consumers, in order to seek higher profits by the businesses, right? And so does, and since C and I goes up, your aggregate demand shifts outwards, causing demand pull inflationary pressures in the economy. Now, guys, we will move on to explaining what cost push inflation is. And since obviously the question is asking to differentiate between, as in to explain what demand pull and cost push is. And cost push inflation basically arises, you'll say that cost push inflation arises because of a rise in the cost of production that is caused due to a rise in input prices, right? So when input prices rise in the economy, across the economy, it affects widely all industries, and that causes the cost of production for the firms to rise in general across the economy, affecting major sectors in the industry, and that results into negative supply shocks. And that is actually shown by this diagram as well, where you can see that your aggregate supply curve shifts to the left from SRAS1 to SRAS2. So this is a basically negative supply shock. It's an exogenous negative supply shock. There's an overnight change in input prices, and you see what happens is when you're saying that input prices go up, what it means is, for example, if you were producing 100 units and the cost of making those 100 units was, let's say, $50, and now the same 100 units are now costing you, let's say, $90 or maybe $150. So that's what a rise in input prices does, that it increases the cost of producing the same level of output. And so what happens is that when the cost of production rises across the economy, across the wider economy, affecting different industries and sectors across the economy, because of a rise in input prices. So basically it the output goes down and the price level goes up because it reduces the ability of the suppliers to meet the demand, right? And the firms across the economy find it difficult to produce because they're faced with higher costs of production because of a rise in input prices. Maybe this negative supply shock is caused due to a rise in raw material prices, or world oil prices, or global oil prices, or global commodity prices shoot up, right? So it becomes difficult for the firms to meet the demand then, and as a result, aggregate supply then goes down, and that is reflected in the form of higher prices across the economy because of a rise in the costs of producing the goods and services due to rise in input prices. And businesses are faced with these higher costs that ultimately leads them to raise prices to maintain their profit margins, and this then contributes to broader inflationary pressures across the economy, because these higher costs due to rise in input prices then seeps through the economy in the form of cost push inflationary pressures. But the downside here is that these cost push inflationary pressures are accompanied with lower output and higher price level, right? And that could potentially be detrimental, right? And so that's one thing that you need to tell in the exam, and draw this diagram clearly, properly labeled. Make sure the diagrams are drawn properly, clearly labeled. I don't remember if I mentioned this before as well, but you should draw your diagram with a scale and pencil, and do not make small diagrams. That doesn't mean that you start making huge diagrams, but yes, diagrams should be of a good, clear size. You don't have any shortage of paper in the exam. You can borrow as many sheets as you want. So please make clear diagrams, clearly labeled, drawn with scale. And then you also need to tell that when cost of production is going up. So you could tell a few reasons, especially tell those reasons that are that is a major cause that's happening around the global economy. Especially raw material commodity prices could increase, such as mention oil. And if there's a rise in oil prices, which is the most significant commodity for, especially for commodity importing nations who are dependent on oil, right? So cost of production for all the firms in the economy will rise, shifting your aggregate supply curve to the left, causing inflation because firms will pass on these higher costs via higher prices, increasing cost push inflation. Or maybe business taxes could rise, like VAT. Indirect taxes could go up. Maybe that could cause, be a significant cause of cost push inflation. Or maybe there's a lot of trade union pressure, especially from growing strong trade unions who could exert economic power. Or the wages are going up because workers are negotiating for higher wages. So if wages are going up more than productivity gains, then obviously costs will rise, because wages has to go up more than the rise in productivity. If the labor productivity is rising simultaneously in line with the rise in wages, then the cost of production will not rise. Cost of production for the firms will only rise if wages are going up. Wages representing input prices, if they are going up for the same level of output more than the rise in productivity. that causes a rise in cost of production for the firms, and that is reflected by a higher cost push inflation because aggregate supply shifts to the left. Or maybe you see these costs could rise in the wider economy because of maybe a weak exchange rate. Maybe exchange rate is going down either due to a currency depreciation or maybe a devaluation by the central bank that causes your imports to become expensive. And if your imports become expensive, but if the demand, the PD for your imports, the price elasticity of demand for your imports is less than one, especially because you're importing oil, let's say, which is a key commodity, and you're an oil importing dependent nation. So in that case, your cost of production would massively rise, and then firms will do mention that firms will pass on these higher costs via higher prices, causing cost push inflation in the wider in the aggregate economy or wider economy or economy, right? And you see, the thing is that when you're talking about cost push inflation, do mention the fact that and these cost push inflation could cause worse consequences for developing economies, especially those economies that are heavily reliant on importing oil. I mean, global oil prices, if they skyrocket, the cost of manufacturing goods will obviously because the cost of when you manufacture goods that require significant energy input, right, which comes from oil. So again, so what? So another transportation cost could be another, by the way, reason that could fuel higher costs, especially if there's an increase in shipping costs, right? And then the effects then spills over or cascades across various industries and sectors, leading to widespread inflationary pressures. So you see, when you explain, so there's a thing that there's a difference between mentioning something and explaining something. When explanation has to be done, the chain of analysis has to be there, right? Treat the examiner like a student, that you are the teacher explaining it to the examiner, right? Okay. So, and do understand that the output of one industry is input for the other industry, and that's how the cost spills over across the economy, right? So when production costs go up, that then spills over across the wider economy, causing cost push inflationary pressures, right? And at times it's also even said that it could just sort of trigger a cost push inflationary cycle, not only affecting one sector across the economy but multiple sectors, leading to higher prices across the economy. Now that we have actually explained both these types of inflation with the diagrams, our next step would be, in fact the last step would be, to evaluate which is more damaging. As the question says, consider in what circumstances one may be more damaging than the other. So you could mention a circumstance where demand push inflation could be more damaging than cost push inflation, and a circumstance where cost push inflation could be more damaging than demand push inflation. And you could say that which of these inflation is more damaging depends upon the economic situation, because this is the evaluation. When you're talking about the evaluation, one of the ways is, or one of the stance that we take is that it depends on, right? So the factors that on which something depends on to sort of prove a narrative, or to sort of um, prove an assertion, is what evaluation is. One part of it is what evaluation is, right? I mean, you could say that it depends upon the economic condition at the moment, which means that if your economy is, let's say, operating at full employment or near full employment or close to full employment, and let's say that demand for inflation becomes prevalent, and so in that case, if demand for inflation goes up, then it can be more damaging, because if the economy is already producing at its maximum capacity or very close to maximum capacity, any further increases in aggregate demand can lead to excessive price increases without corresponding increase in output. And you could mention Keynes as well, John Maynard Keynes, who suggested that once your economy reaches full employment, let's say at somewhere over here, any further increases in aggregate demand would result into just inflationary pressures without any increase in your real GDP, right? And that is why, guys, whenever AD goes up, like this region basically, whenever AD goes up in this particular region, when your aggregate supply is vertical, basically, that itself, the vertical representation is representing that, the firms cannot respond because they have exhausted their capacity. And as a result, and as a result, if aggregate demand goes up in this particular region, it basically results in, heightened inflation and price levels to go up, overshooting price levels with no increase in real GDP at all. And this is basically, in this region, your economy, if your AD is going up, it results in overheating of the economy. Use this term, this is a good term to use, overheating of the economy, which simply means severe inflationary pressures where there is unsustainable pressure on factors of production, causing that culminates into demand pull inflationary pressures, and ultimately with no increase in output at all, because you have reached full employment and your economy is on the verge of exploding in the context that everything is getting expensive but there's no increase in output. So your economic welfare of the people and the economy is not going up in that context, because prices are just going up without any increase in output, and that will ultimately result in destabilization of the economy, right? And that's why demand pull inflation could be severely damaging. Although you need to understand, guys, which is very very important, and that is demand pull inflation, some form of demand pull inflation or mild inflation, or a stable demand pull inflation at a low rate is considered desirable for the economy, because demand pull inflation to an extent is desirable because it results in higher real GDP and lower cyclical unemployment. So in that context, it makes it desirable, yeah, right? But then only when it results in higher real GDP and lower cyclical unemployment, not when it's only resulting in higher price level with no increase in real GDP, which could happen once your economy achieves full employment. So in that case, demand inflation could be damaging. While on the other hand, we could say that if your economy is experiencing a recession, or let's say there's a massive underutilization of resources, then cost push inflation will be more damaging. Because this thing is that, even if you have demand pull inflation, but then, if your economy was already in a massive recession, then some form of demand pull inflation is not damaging at all, but it's worthwhile and it's good for healthy and desirable for the economy. So let's say if you are somewhere over here, if you were somewhere over here, although you don't, it's an 8 mark question, you don't need to go into all these in a lot of detail by making all these diagrams, but then at least you should have the knowledge that you can use, because it could easily come in a 12 marker as well, such an evaluation. So if your economy was somewhere over here, let's say, right, way below full employment, right, and if your AD goes up from, let's say, 80 naught to 81, right, so this is in this inflation is considered healthy, because your economy is now recovering, because at Y1 your economy is well below full employment, and you have at Y1 you have a huge negative output gap, right, or a recessionary gap, because you're well below full employment and you're undergoing a huge recession. So in that case, this inflation is healthy and it's not damaging at all. But in this situation, let's say your economy is in a recessionary phase, in such a situation, if your economy experiences cost push inflation, so that could be more damaging, right? So demand pull inflation, especially in a phase where the economy is recovering from a recession, is not damaging. But yes, cost push inflation could be damaging, because cost push inflation could just further result. The cost push inflation will just keep you back. Would decrease the real GDP back to probably where it was initially. So let's say if you sort of you say that if the government is trying to come up with expansionary policy where it increases aggregate demand, and so there's some form of demand pull inflation, while that is not damaging. But let's say if the economy is met with exogenous independent rise in input prices, negative supply shocks, maybe world oil prices go up. Let's say if it's a poor, weak developing country already, with a weak economy, so in that case your aggregate supply would go down, which will result in a fall in real GDP, and that falling real GDP is a sign of negative growth rates, and that is again a sign of recessionary impacts, right? And if this persists, if such a cost push inflation persists, negative supply shocks persist, it could well below um, push the economy into a recession, and such a recession will be from the supply side. Recessions are not necessarily always from the demand side, although they are more associated from the demand side, where AD falls for a consecutive, where you have negative growth rates for consecutive 2 quarters coming from the demand side. But then at times recessions could also come from the supply side, where aggregate supply goes down and real GDP goes down. So in that case, such a recession, where you have a recession and you have cost push inflation, so that could be really, really, really damaging. So what we're saying is that if your economy is recovering from a recession, so demand pull inflation will not be a problem. But then if that is accompanied by cost push inflationary pressures, it could sort of worsen the already existing recession that you have. It will worsen already existing recession that you have, basically, right? And so, and so the problem with cost push inflation is that cost push inflationary pressures are more damaging in the context that economists argue that cost push inflation is more damaging than demand pull inflation, because it results in a phenomenon known as stagflation, where you not only is your inflation levels, your price level going up, but at the same time you have a lot of unemployment as well in the economy. Right? And so what that does is that cost push inflation, this unemployment will result in, and as firms reduce output, this would result in negative growth rates, or it would slow down the economy, and ultimately if this persists, it could result in just your growth rates to go negative, which will mean a recession coming from the supply side, and it could just keep on worsening itself. And we've already studied in cost push inflation as well, it could result in the risk of your economy spiraling into a recession, where it could just multiply itself. Your cost push inflation could multiply itself, and your economy just gets stuck in a inflationary spiral, wage price spiral, and this can just exacerbate the economic downturn and exacerbate the recessionary impacts. So yes, cost push inflations are also associated with economic recessions, because here your economy's real GDP is declining. So that itself is recessionary. If not a full-fledged recession, then it is at least recessionary as well, leading to lower growth rates and potentially higher unemployment. So in that case, you could argue that if your economy is already well below full employment, and it has not utilized it's underutilizing its resources, your economy is operating well below full capacity, and in that case, when cost push inflation occurs, your economy could severely struggle to to manage. The economy could struggle, because a lot of macroeconomic indicators will not be met, because higher unemployment, and then the recessionary impacts coming from the supply side, where your real GDP is going down and unemployment is going up, which would obviously be followed by falling tax revenues and falling living standards. And falling tax revenues would mean that the government will not have the money to deal with income support programs for the unemployed and all of that. So there's a lot that you can write. Although this is an 8-mark question, you don't have to write a lot, you don't have to go into a lot of details. But then this could easily come as a 12-marker as well, especially the evaluation part or the comparison part between demand pull and cost push. So yeah, that's one of the reasons that you could mention that which is more damaging than the other, right? So now, guys, the last part of this answer would be that you write a conclusion, right? And when you're concluding your answer, you're ending your essay, and these are just your final words. And you see, a common error that students usually make in this essay, that they will say, okay, fine, both demand pull, hence both demand pull, or to conclude, both demand pull and cost push inflation is bad or is unhealthy. Now, why do they write like this? Because probably they don't know what else to write, right? And here is where I come in, and I'm telling you that a good way to write your answer could be where you sort of give a balanced view, considering both the sides of the demand pull and cost push inflation and their potential impacts. And then also remember that a good thing to do in conclusion is to probably suggest a solution that you could end up saying, that your conclusion could be that you could say that to conclude, both demand pull and cost push inflation can have damaging consequences, right? While some demand pull inflation is healthy, excessive demand pull inflation could be a cause of concern, requiring contractionary demand management policies and contraction and stabilization policies, followed by contractionary demand management. which a company is obviously monitoring, contractually monitoring fiscal. While on the other hand, you could say that while on the other hand, cost push inflation is considered a serious concern since it results in falling real GDP and unemployment at the same time, right? With a potential threat of pushing the economy into a huge wage price spiral, where it could become difficult to come out of it. Anyways, so and then the last line could be that you could end your answer by saying hence policymakers, and this is where the suggestion comes in, that you could say that hence policymakers must come up with effective demand side and supply side policies to address the inflationary concerns in an economy. Full stop. And that would end your answer. So that's it, guys. I will be ending the video here now, and I hope you understood this video and enjoyed this as well. If you did, then do mention it in the comments and let me know that how did you find this video and whether you would want me to create more of such videos, and what topics do you want me to address in the future videos. Wish you all the best, guys. Keep hustling, keep grinding. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, take care.